doused by heavy fabrics, okay, by curtains. Now, the whole point of heavy fabric curtains was to be able to seal the outside out, okay? Shutters as well were frequently used. Within the space of the house, often you'd have elaborate hedges and hedgerows planted in front of the house, gardens, everything to try and screen the privacy of the household from the public gaze. The less privacy you had, the less prestigious, the less status you had. Within the house, you then have all the development of the rituals of family life that we now hold so dear to ourselves. So the ritual of eating together as a family over a meal, of having dinner together, of having, and I'm sure no one does this anymore, but having evening readings or entertainments. When I was a kid and TV wasn't really, no, I'm that old, TV wasn't really such a big thing in the third world that is the UK. We used to occasionally put on shows for our parents in a slightly grotesque and embarrassing type of way. The Christmas and Easter gathering of, obviously around the Christian calendar, but the gathering of the extended family around these big events. Birthday celebrations, again, something that is largely a Victorian invention. The idea of going on weekend walks, hikes, or going out to the park. All of these ways were a way of performing family life in front of others and to one's selves. And much of it an invention of the Victorian period. The other key element of this is that the valorization of motherhood, not simply care of the family or the care of the husband, as the key attribute for women. So Samuel Smiles, the author of many self-help books, described the nursery. The nation comes from the nursery. The nation comes from the nursery. That is to say, the health of the nation, the prestige of the nation, starts by the job of motherhood. And by the 1870s and 1880s, that importance attached to motherhood begins to have an increasingly imperial dimension. That the racial health of the British ability to be able to rule the waves and expand their empire, rested on the very simple jobs of good mother care. Okay? That if you didn't raise children properly, that they would become deformed and degenerate and unable to do Britain's imperial work. One last point I'll say about this, and this is a whole other thing. This is reflecting also in the division of education, the way in which people are educated. Okay, so very interestingly, boys suddenly in about the 1860s began getting sent away to boarding schools. Okay, so the middle class would suddenly decided that they would trust the education of their children to people they'd never met, often didn't know, and was at some distance from them. Okay? And this was a way in which men would develop the type of moral, manly character and athletic, muscular, Christian form that was seen to be appropriate for them. Girls, in contrast, were kept close to the home, often educated at home by governess, by a private governess or by private tutors, because their education was merely preparatory to a life of on the marriage market. Okay, I'm going to crack through a couple more sections and then pause for questions, because I don't want to run out of time today. So I've been talking about the way in which this ideology of separate spheres was an aspiration, not a reality. And the most obvious example of that is the way in which women played a very important role in the workforce. Okay? Now, clearly, if the ideology of separate spheres had been a reality, women wouldn't have been in the workforce at all. But women and children, and here women and children are often lumped together, had been an important form of traditional forms of production. When you had a production centered upon a household or a workshop where all the members of the family would be engaged in different tasks. Okay? Now that, very interestingly, that division of labour between men, women and children in the home actually became very important to early factory production. So textile mills, which were the first real factories in Britain in the late 18th century, brought in women and children to provide the same assistance to men spinning as they had done in the domestic workshops. The problem was that in these new factories they lacked the type of patriarchal oversight that they had at home by their fathers, so that they were seen to be, if you like, morally at risk and morally adrift in this new environment of the factory. And increasingly, the critics of factory production and the critics of laissez-faire liberal political economy held out the condition of women and children in the new textile mills as a sign of its moral bankruptcy. And so the movement for factory reform actually begins in the 18 teens as a movement to try and take women and children out of factories. And there are a whole series of factory acts in the first half of the 19th century who tried to do this in a series of sequential steps. Nonetheless, even though children were taken out of factory production, women are left in, because the textile industry really became increasingly dependent upon the women workforce. And most women of the labouring classes, of the labouring poor, basically had to work in order to keep the family out of the workhouse. Okay? So the family wage, the collective family wage, was absolutely necessary. The aggregate wage of the man, the woman, and often their children was necessary in order to sustain the family as a whole. In the ideal world, after marriage, women were meant to have at best part-time work. That is to say that they would work, do occasional work from home. It would be needlework, it would be cleaning work, it could be seasonal agricultural work, it could be laundry work. All of those types of part-time engagement was what women would prefer to do rather than continue to be in the full-time labour. Now, very interestingly, that type of work, that part-time casual work, becomes increasingly invisible in the 19th century. From the 1881 census, those categories of domestic labour don't even get registered on the census. They no longer count as official forms of labour. So we have a real gap in our knowledge about what happens to that casualised part-time work in the second half of the 19th century. Nonetheless, unmarried women, women who aren't able to, whose husbands are out of work or whose husbands can't keep the family as a whole, continue to work. And the two most populous forms of women's work in the 19th century were what? What do you think they were? Any guesses? Domestic service. Domestic service accounts for 22% of female employment in the second half of the 19th century. What else? Textiles, 40%. Textiles account for 40% of women's employment. Now, domestic service is, in a way, and domestic service continues to be hugely important, basically down to the Second World War. Domestic service is seen to be more respectable than working in a textile mill because it's in a domestic environment, okay, and because it's under the duty of care of the men of the household, and it's a type of modelling of a different family life. Now, because I'm a fan of the show The In-Betweeners, I sort of think of this slide as The In-Betweeners. This is the sort of liminal space between working and not working. And in the second half of the 19th century, particularly from the 1860s and 1870s onwards, there is an increasingly agonized debate and set of concerns about the position of women appearing in public spaces. Okay? Up until this point, women basically would not be seen in public spaces unchaperoned, okay? Because it was considered to be lax and immoral, and to show that you were bad moral character. From the 1860s and 1870s, what you have in London especially, but also in other big cities like Manchester and Birmingham and Liverpool and Leeds, is the development of spaces for shopping that were seen to be, or try to cultivate, a new air of respectability around them. So I'm going to give you the example of London, just because you're more likely to have heard of the places and the stores. So the first big department store in London was a place called Whiteley's on Westbourne Grove in Bayswater. It was followed by Harrods, which was built in the 1880s, and then Liberty's and Selfridge's and Debenhams. Okay? Now, it's not the stores that are so important, even though the stores do key things to make shopping respectable. First of all, as you know, they create bathrooms for the convenience of ladies of leisure. Okay? Second of all, they create an environment of lots of different departments that make workers appear as a type of servant. Okay? So it was meant to be that women would go out from managing their servants, and they would go out into stores, and the public and the shop workers would act as a type of servant. And these stores were styled in ways that seemed like you were moving from home to home in many ways. They had tea rooms as well, sort of public tea rooms that were very important. Regent Street in London, which is what this image shows, was actually reconstructed around this crescent, where all the department stores, I'm sure you've all been shopping, or lots of you have been shopping in Regent Street and Oxford Street. This was really the first purpose-built area for shopping. Okay, and the interesting thing about it is it's in a sort of in-between space where it's perilously close to Soho